Brent Walth is an Oregon journalist who has received a dozen awards for his political, environmental, and investigative reporting. He is currently a Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Oregonian and has worked for Willamette Week as state capitol correspondent and for the Register Guard. His book, Fire at Eden's Gate, Tom McCall and the Oregon Story, has received an award of commendation from the American Association of State and Local History. President Clinton, during a visit to Portland in June, also offered praise for the book, calling it a remarkable biography. As former Governor Tom McCall's biographer, Brent Walth will discuss today how Governor McCall used his leadership qualities and what lessons his influence holds for Oregon today. Our second speaker, Betty Roberts, is a former legislator and former Oregon Supreme Court Justice. She will comment on the governing of Oregon by Tom McCall as a phenomenal union of man, times, and place. Tom McCall's unique character and ability to transmit his vision of Oregon during trying but challenging years were irresistible more than 2 decades ago. While the environmental program he championed gave us a more livable Oregon, his legacy of leadership is as significant and enduring. Our third speaker, Ed Westerdahl, earned degrees in speech and political science from PSU. After that, he worked for PGE in public affairs, representing PGE at the state and local level. That's where he met Tom McCall. Ed ran Tom McCall's campaign for Secretary of State. When Governor McCall took office, Ed became his right arm. In that position, he had a chance to observe Governor McCall's leadership firsthand. Ed will share with us his observations of that leadership style. With that, I turn the podium over to Brent Walth.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back home in Portland after being in Washington for so long. And I'm happy to be here, and I'm flattered to be asked. I think the City Club has taken up a compelling theme here. And that's the question of leadership here in Oregon. It's taken up this theme, I think, at a time when we've too often lacked leadership in politics and government. I've spent 10 years covering politics in Oregon. And I've seen firsthand a lot of times when there's been failure of our elected officials to lead. Well, certainly I've learned one thing, and that's that people are not leaders simply because they hold power or simply because they get elected to something. And let me tell you, if there's one thing I've learned covering this Congress, it's that almost anybody can get elected to something. Indeed, our expectations in Oregon are higher for our leaders. In Oregon, we expect our leaders to be not only honest, but earnest, and also to be innovative and progressive. And we expect this because Tom McCall was once this state's governor. McCall became a force that transformed this state's image and defined its values. And a decade after his death, he still overshadows Oregon's politics. The fundamental debate we have in Oregon today is over how to fulfill the challenge he gave us, and that is how to protect Oregon's livability. He challenged Oregon by first showing how this could be done. He protected Oregon's public beaches from private plunder. He finished the stalled 40-year effort to clean up the Willamette River. He reined in polluting industries and preached the gospel of recycling and conservation. He stamped out a template of planning and growth standards that, while under strain today, still seek to conserve Oregon's land. He didn't invent the bottle bill, but he held it up high for America to see as a beacon to follow. Foremost, McCall gave Oregon a doctrine it can not just live by, but one on which it can thrive. And that doctrine was this: that a state with such beauty and natural wealth should remain cautious about how it surrenders its air, its water, and its land. Well, the livability that he protected stands today as Oregon's true economic power. The state thrives as it does because McCall, nearly 30 years ago, decided that Oregon should not mortgage its future for short-term greed. Now imagine that, a politician concerned more for tomorrow than today. Well, how did he do it? How did he become so dominant so overpowering, so lasting? In other words, how did he lead? Well, that's what I wanted to understand in 1986 when I first began researching McCall's life and career. I wanted to write this book because I wanted to find out if the McCall I remembered from my childhood was the real thing, that is, the true leader. In the mid-'80s, his reputation had been sullied quite a bit, and I wanted to see if my memory held. Well, what I learned could fill a book, but I'll try to keep it shorter than that today. He was born to a Massachusetts family of power and wealth, but he was raised in virtual poverty in the Central Oregon desert. But his family legacy taught him that he owed something back to his community. And to those ends, he worked as a newspaper reporter, a radio announcer, and a television commentator. For 3 decades, he used his microphone and his typewriter to scrutinize government, to question politicians, and to advocate common sense answers to the problems that plagued Oregon. He's often praised for his courage, and I think his courage was manifested most often from his career in journalism, that is, his determination to tell it as he saw it. In 1967, his fame propelled him to the governorship, and at the time, the Salem political pros considered him something of a lightweight. Indeed, early in his first term, it wasn't always clear that his administration would be judged all that well. But he had a lot of help. He had a good staff. He had rosy economic times to help him. And he had a friendly press corps. Most of all, he had a public that was not yet suspicious of every word that a politician uttered. But throughout, McCall remained popular despite what were some very bold flaws as well. He could be short-tempered and foul-mouthed and impetuous. His insecurities often towered over even his own 6.5-foot frame. He was often accused of nabbing the credit that was due to others. But you know, he rarely hid his flaws. He was a very painfully, publicly human politician. And Oregonians proved remarkably forgiving. I think they were forgiving because they knew that he offered them leadership. And the best way I can define his leadership is by describing 3 basic qualities. And the first quality was what I call his vision. Now, we talk so much of the need for vision from our leaders that it often sounds cliche. We want our leaders to stand up and tell us, describe an Oregon 5 or 10 or 20 years from now. And then we want them to tell us how to get there. But to work, a vision expressed by a political leader, I think, must be one that the public can embrace. And it has to be one that's both grand enough to inspire, but simple enough that we can believe it to be attainable. Well, not everybody can do this, but McCall did. Today we see the politics of division and destruction overwhelming government. But even in his own strife-torn era, McCall understood that the themes that can unite the state. He could see the bright strands of basic values that linked Pendleton with Eugene or Astoria with Ashland. And then he could pull those strands together. It added up to a vision that is expressed simply this way: that Oregon should recognize its inherent strength, its livability, and do everything possible to protect it. As he put it in his first inaugural address, the overriding challenge, the umbrella issue, is quality of life in Oregon. Well, this wasn't a throwaway line. This was the foundation of everything that he did. And with this vision comes the second quality of his leadership, what I call voice. His years as a writer and a broadcaster had taught him how to harness language, and he could turn the dullest of topics into music, with the melody of his delivery, the harmony of his meaning, and the evocative chords of his sentiment that he knew could captivate Oregonians. Well, now, I never do McCall's words any justice when I read them, but I want you to consider this example. In 1973, McCall proposed what amounted to a sweeping reform in the state's zoning policies. Well, this would be dry stuff coming from any other politician. But listen to how McCall described the need for land use planning. There is a shameless threat to our environment and the whole quality of life, the unfettered despoiling of the land. Sagebrush subdivisions, coastal condomania, and the ravenous rampage of suburbia in the Willamette Valley all threaten to mock Oregon's status as the environmental model for the nation. The interest of Oregon for today and in the future must be protected from the grasping wastrels of the land. Now, it's the power of words such as these that transformed his programs into ideals. And these words invited Oregonians to imagine a state protected and secure from environmental decay. Well, he also knew the value of political drama and of showbiz, and he bristled at the notion that he took any of that too far. He once took offense when someone compared his rise into politics from television to the rise of his Republican neighbor, California Governor Ronald Reagan. He protested that he was a television journalist, after all, and not a movie actor. As he put it, in all my years as a broadcaster, I never smiled at anyone. Then he added, "You can't say that I beguiled them." Well, he was beguiling now and then, but not to mislead, but to romance. And that was part of his appeal. Oregonians might not have always believed that their state was in Eden, but they wanted a leader who said it was so. Vision and voice. Those are two parts. But there's a third part, and I want to illustrate this with my favorite McCall story. In 1970, there was a budget miscalculation in the state's welfare budget, and the state was forced to cut its welfare spending. Well, faced with this unpleasant task, McCall signed a budget order to cut the welfare spending until he could find more money in the budget. Well, soon afterward, he took a phone call from an elderly Salem woman who told him that her assistance check had been cut and that she feared losing her telephone service. She was an invalid, she told him, and her telephone was her only lifeline. Well, McCall immediately convened his staff and demanded to know what could be done for this woman. His staff explained that he couldn't revoke an entire budget order just to help with this one person. So McCall went around the table and he took up a collection. And for the months to follow, he paid this woman's phone bill. And as one staff member who was there put it, that was Tom's approach to things. He couldn't believe that government could let people just go like that. Well, this is my favorite McCall story because it underscores the third quality of his leadership, a vanishing quality among many of today's politicians, and that's accountability. McCall could not make it right for everyone hurt by his budget order, but this tale shows that he could make the difficult decisions without losing his sense of humanity. It also shows his political wisdom. When he had to, he made these budget cuts on his own, and he didn't call the legislature into special session. If he should be accountable, McCall said, then Oregonians should be accountable too. He held out ideals, but he always made clear that the price of those ideals could be high, and he talked about the value of sacrifice. He asked, "Do you want a better environment?" Then he said, "Take responsibility, save energy, drive less, and curb what he called America's no deposit, no return ways of waste." You want to fix school financing, he asked? Then be prepared to pay for it. His 1973 tax plan was classically progressive. Income tax would have been levied on ability to pay, and schools would have been guaranteed stable financing. Well, his plan wasn't popular, but he didn't shrink from being his champion. During his exhaustive and lonely campaign for this measure, he was sitting in a Eugene restaurant one night when he heard a conversation at the other table. And from the conversation, McCall learned that the man at the other table was a doctor who had just moved into the state from California. McCall surmised this doctor was making a pretty good living, but this doctor was also complaining very loudly that the governor's tax plan would cost him $800 more every year. McCall stood up and walked over and introduced himself. And at this point, he might have taken the politician's way. He might have just thanked the man for sharing his views. Well, he chose his own way. "You SOB," he told him. "If you don't care any more than that for the schools of Oregon, why don't you go back to California?" Vision, voice, accountability. These qualities frame McCall's gift of leadership. And people often ask me, when are we going to see another one like him? Well, let me close today by giving you McCall's own definition of leadership, and by explaining why our search for another one like him should begin and end with ourselves. McCall was once asked why he thought Americans were having trouble finding leaders or finding heroes. Heroes, he said, heroes are not just giant statues framed against a red sky. They are people who say, "This is my community, and it's my responsibility to make it better." In the end, I can think of no better way to explain what motivated Tom McCall. For McCall's own definition of leadership holds a lesson for all of us. Don't just wait for someone else to lead you. Instead, set out on your own to make your community a better place to live. Thanks.
Well, I'm happy to be here today, too, and I am delighted with the subject that was assigned to us. My particular assignment is to speak about Tom McCall from my perspective as a legislator during his administration, and to comment on how his leadership created an unusually strong sense of community during that period. I begin with the age-old question which I first heard in a political science class at the then Portland State College from Professor Marco Haggard. Do the times make the man or the man the times? And the answer, of course, is elusive. But with Tom McCall, the answer has to be both, with an added ingredient of place. First, it's probably a good thing for Oregon that Tom lost his bid for Congress in 1954. For on hindsight, Tom was not yet ready and the stage was not yet set for what was really to be his destiny. The next 10 years in journalism gave him credibility on issues and recognition, if not yet charisma, with people all over the state. Those years led him to focus on the problems he saw and the people who could do something about them. There were many who helped shape Tom McCall: his family, his staff, various political advisors, legislators, both professional and citizen lobbyists, other state elected officials, particularly his perennial political opponent and friend, Bob Straub. Journalists of all sorts. Bob Straub did influence Tom McCall a lot, and we know. Journalists of all sorts, anyone who had any good ideas or could help him get his message out. Together, all of us contributed to the Tom McCall legacy. But make no mistake, it was Tom McCall himself who made us want to do it. So what was it that made Tom McCall a great governor for Oregon? It has been said that an unconventional childhood leads to an unconventional life. Growing up in the great openness of Eastern Oregon, he gained a passion for Oregon as a unique place. As a child, he learned the inventive power of words. Along with that, he had an aristocratic, well-educated, strong-willed mother who turned living in what some would call a desolate environment, an oasis of learning and stimulating family life. I remember well when Tom was to be sworn in as governor of Oregon in January 1967. Beforehand, the usual ritual was taking place in which the senators were escorted into the House of Representatives, followed by the judges of the Supreme Court, then the statewide elected officials, the outgoing governor, then Mark Hatfield, and Tom McCall was expected to be next. Not so. There was one more. It was announced that Dorothy Lawson McCall, the mother of the new governor, would be escorted into the House chambers, but not by the usual cadre of House and Senate members. With uniformed members of the Oregon National Guard preceding her, this flamboyant, proud woman came into the chambers on the arm of the commanding general. Many were surprised at the audacity of this scene. But I stood at my desk and I looked at Dorothy McCall and I just said to myself, now there's a mother. Another very important person in Tom's life was, of course, Audrey McCall. Audrey was the exact opposite of Dorothy McCall, and probably a good thing, because only Audrey, with her warm grace, secure independence, and genuine compassion, could have held her own with a woman like Dorothy McCall. And Audrey's not here today, I understand, but I certainly would like her to know that she had the sympathy of every daughter-in-law in this state. Audrey's personal strength and devotion to Tom was admired by us all. She was undoubtedly a steadying influence on him. While we most focus on the environmental achievements of the McCall administration, for that was indeed the centerpiece of his administration. It is also important to focus on other aspects of the times and to look at his leadership for lessons we need very badly today. Let me set the stage a bit. On the national scene, the Vietnam War was at its peak. Thousands of young men were dying and demonstrations were an everyday fact of life. Students were killed at Kent State, and Oregon students responded with their own demonstrations. The Civil Rights War was at its peak. Medgar Evers was killed, Martin Luther King was killed, and demonstrations on this issue were an everyday fact of life, with the burning of the Watts District in Los Angeles and riots in other cities in the country. Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968, and the Democratic Convention erupted in turmoil over the Vietnam issue. Richard Nixon was elected president. He was re-elected 4 years later and then was forced to resign before the end of McCall's second term. As governor, Tom McCall supported the action in Vietnam, but he cooled demonstrations in Oregon with his famous Vortex Party and by meeting personally with students. He responded with eloquent outrage on the causes of the civil rights demonstrations, and he mourned with us the death of national leaders. His dislike of Nixon is well documented in Brent's book, as well as the fact that he was frequently at odds with his party at both the national and state level. In Oregon, like nationally, the past was being clearly severed from the future. Many of us welcomed those dramatic changes as a way not only to preserve Oregon as a unique corner of the world environmentally, but to make our state unique in many other respects. When Tom McCall became governor, legislators had no offices or aides. The lobby was primarily business, labor, and governmental agencies. And committees held unannounced meetings. Most legislators were elected from multi-member districts, and there was little regulation on our campaign activities. Beginning about 1967, coincidental with McCall becoming governor, all that changed and much more. We are well informed on the beach bill, the cleanup of the Willamette River, land use legislation, the bottle bill, and many other environmental achievements. I want to emphasize that there was similar aggressive activity in other areas. Interest groups began to form around the need for consumer protection legislation. The legislature responded with truth in lending, landlord-tenant rights, unit pricing, a cooling-off period for home solicitation sales, and that list could go on. Interest groups that wanted government reform came to the legislature, and a lobby regulation bill was passed. Open meetings became the law. Election reform groups urged passage of single-member districts and of truth in advertising for political candidates in the voters' pamphlet and other political material. During that period, we saw the growth of women's political organizations. A bill passed decriminalizing abortions in Oregon. We were one of the earliest states to do so. Other legislation was passed prohibiting discrimination of women in employment, in the granting of credit, and in public accommodations. Allowing a woman to retain her name upon marriage and to return to a name upon divorce was approved. Bills providing for equal opportunity for young women and girls in sports activities in high schools and colleges were passed. And the Equal Rights Amendment was ratified by the legislature during the McCall era. There was much, much more on women's issues also. My purpose in going through this litany is to remind us of the startling and rapid changes that were occurring in our state and nation, and to say that much of Oregon's legislation was seen by other states to be just as precedent-setting as the environmental legislation we were passing. A great deal of this legislation would not have passed without Tom McCall, not because he directly involved himself in it, but because he created a climate in which it could happen. His strong stand on issues carried over to the rest of us. By his example, we became bolder in initiating and working for our own legislation. While his leadership seemed spontaneous, he seemed always ready to deal with the consequences. Tom liked to stir things up. He could not tolerate inaction. He was a spark that ignited the rest of us into action. Tom was often criticized for lacking diplomacy because of his bluntness, but we sometimes saw him genuinely meek and apologetic when he felt he had gone too far. Very rare. A large amount of credit for both the success of those years and the legacy that remains must go to Tom's staff. While Tom had a great ability to orchestrate, usually through the media, by instructing, giving cues, inspiring, and sometimes haranguing, what we saw was the hard work of people like Ed Westerdahl, Ron Smith, and many others who worked with Tom in the executive office. Tom attracted talented people because they saw his abilities, but it was they who kept him focused and informed and often protected him from himself. Without a doubt, the most significant factor in the achievements of those years was the bipartisan cooperation and trust that existed between most Democrats and most Republicans. There were exceptions, and there were issues where partisanship was paramount. But on the kinds of legislation I have described, we worked together, not always agreeing on the fine points, but usually with a spirit of respect and willingness to work on compromises. Tom McCall's partisan independence helped make that so. For me, the outstanding feature of the McCall era was that while we were going through national tragedies, almost one right after the other, and at the same time going through the greatest transition period in the history of the state, we as Oregonians did it with class. Because Tom McCall, as governor, and the staff he chose to help him were a real class act. No wonder Oregon gained the reputation for being different. We were different. We are not likely to find another Tom McCall, and we should not expect to, because the place has changed and the times have changed. Today's leaders must address those changes in their own way. The McCall era is a period we can't recapture any more than Tom could recapture the governorship 4 years later. The time was right, the place was right, and the man was right for what needed to be done then. What we can do now is understand that Oregon is still that extraordinary place Tom envisioned and most Oregonians continue to want it to be today. It may not long remain so if extreme partisanship prevents reasoned discussion and cooperation among our legislators and with our governor. The changes taking place today in Oregon may be as dramatic as those 25 years ago, and we must deal with them bravely and boldly. In an editorial recently, Mark Sussman suggested we must find common ground and focus on what brings us together rather than what pulls us apart. I'm not sure yet whether there is a ray of hope from the results of the recent tortured legislative session that can happen now. I am sure that there is one McCall characteristic we should still expect of our elected officials, which is that first, and above all else, they love Oregon and its people.
Well, I'm in a relatively weak position following a professional wordsmith and a very successful politician, both of which are wordsmiths beyond belief. I'm going to approach Tom from a little different angle. First of all, I want to dispel a rumor and a popular notion. Tom McCall was not a politician. And anybody who tries to label him as a politician doesn't understand the definition of politician. Second, I will say that Tom McCall, if he were here today at his prime, probably could not be elected. And the reason is that he was not a politician. He was an honest, open human being who said what he felt, who took risk, who didn't look at polls and determine positions. He had instincts that were incredible. And we're talking about leadership and sense of community. I want to start with that one. You had a human being who was so well motivated and so committed to people and the state that he embraced every idea his opponent had that was a good one, whether it's Straub or somebody else. He encouraged staff and departments and agencies to break new ground, to not accept limitation, to not accept barriers. The concept of the McCall administration was very simple. The authority stops when it hits somebody else's nose and they hit back. And I will give you some examples. But I want to talk about a part of Tom McCall that nobody talks about and that you didn't talk about much in the book. Within the first 2 years of his administration, he established what was called the Management 70s Task Force. And this was 90 business people on loan from corporations throughout the state, and I think it was more than just business people. It's too long ago for me to remember. They spent months going through every aspect of state government, coming up with recommendations, coming up with ways to improve delivery systems, ways to work more efficiently, ways to save money. That's not talked about a lot in the press, but it led to restructuring of government. It led to incredible efficiencies, and it was done long before the Grace Commission at the Washington level, and there's another significant difference. The Grace Commission, virtually nothing has been implemented. The Management 70s Task Force, I'd say a good 70 to 80% of those recommendations were implemented. The second thing people aren't real aware of, when Tom put together a second budget, not the first one, he had put together a management by objectives program. Every state agency was trained in it. They had to identify what they were trying to do, how they were trying to get there, how they were going to spend their money, what results could reasonably be expected before they could get a budget approved. To my knowledge, that had never been done by a public agency in the United States, let alone a state. During that same period of time, or maybe it was the third year, he established unilaterally 18 administrative districts in the state of Oregon because the legislature, pardon me, Betty, did not want to put together a formal planning process that tied together state agencies, local governments, and a decision-making process that could be rational, taking into account all of the interests involved. There was great resistance to those, particularly in LeGrand. I wouldn't go to LeGrand during that period of time because I was convinced I would be shot. But he put that into effect because he knew, when you're talking sense of community, get your key decision makers together, identify a program, establish goals, rationalize your resources, and accomplish something. If you're not going to accomplish anything, don't spend the time and effort. We have very little time here, but I can go on. And in Capsule, he was a risk taker. He was not a politician. He made so many decisions that a politician wouldn't make. It was unreal. We disarmed the Oregon National Guard before Kent State. He did Vortex, which was the first legal pot festival in the United States. He set up administrative districts. When the legislature told him he couldn't have an ombudsman, he said, to hell with it. The state should have an ombudsman. Marco Haggard was a wonderful ombudsman. In other words, he did the things he felt were right. And I look back with incredible pride at having been associated with a person of that caliber. Thank you.
Lou, would you ask the first question, and then we'll turn it over to members of the audience.
Thank you. In 1973, I decided that I would come to Oregon, primarily because I had heard about this guy named Tom McCall.
No, it's because you didn't listen to him.
No, that's why. No, that's exactly why. I knew that if anybody was going to be audacious enough to tell everybody to not come, I figured there's got to be something there. And I got out here and found out that I was correct. And I disagree a bit with you, Betty. The sense of hope is still there in the state. But it is severely stressed. So the question I have, indeed, is how do we begin to address the issues that are facing us now? We have a sense of what how Tom McCall would address things then, and his legacy here in this room and throughout the state. But how do we begin to address some of the balkanization that we see, some of the greed, some of the lack of respect, and the need for sacrifice? How would, given your knowledge of Tom McCall and the ideas that he passed along to you and to all of us, how would you all three address those particular issues?
I presume this is on here, this mic is on. You know, I thought about, as I was preparing my remarks, what Tom McCall would have done in this last legislative session if he had been governor. And I sort of concluded he probably would have gone into the various districts of those obstreperous Republicans who go by the rule of 18, and he would have gone to their districts, and he would have talked to the people in the district through the media, and he would have challenged them. He would have been very critical of them, and he would have asked all the people of Oregon to work on their legislators to bring about the change. But then I realized that probably that legislative session wouldn't have happened in the first place if Tom McCall had been governor. That probably in the last session, somehow or other, that funding for light rail would have been done, and there would not have been a special session. But because Tom had the power of words, and because he had the people with him in terms of what he wanted to do by his own persuasive abilities, he was able then to get the legislators to move, because the legislators didn't want to go out publicly opposing Tom McCall. And so I think that was his great abilities. What we do today with the people we have there, because we don't have Tom McCall to chastise them and to scold them and to get something done, I think, is that we as individual citizens, picking up on Brent's comment, and he can follow and say this on his own again, that we as citizens of this state must make those demands. We must speak, perhaps not as eloquently as Tom McCall spoke, but we must speak to those legislators and demand that they consider the entire future of this state rather than their own favorite interests.
The thing that always struck me about the way the legislature works is that it's not always been Republican and Democrat. It's mostly been urban and rural. And I think we saw the same thing with this last special session, and it's been, I think, historically true that that's where the tensions lie. And the question is, how do we get past that? Well, I think that Ed described a pretty good way, and that is to first consider what communities or regions need, but fundamentally to also consider what items on Oregon's agenda at any given time are of statewide need and interest. And if light rail, for example, angers people in eastern Oregon or southern Oregon, then it probably angers them because they have felt left out, because no one has sat down and taken into account what it is they need right in their community. And I think building that way, building from communities up to where everyone can agree on statewide issues of statewide significance, while at the same time giving regions and communities the sense and, in fact, the reality that their needs are being taken care of, I think would, for example, in the case of light rail, would probably disarm most, if not all, of the anger about it.
We're looking at two very different environments. And Tom McCall's environment was basically the end of what I would call the citizen legislator era, where Staff Hansels and John Mosser, who's here, and Betty and others gave of themselves to help the state, which is what Tom has done. Our media has changed. We're exposing every wart that a person has or doesn't have based upon every charge. We have set up an adversarial environment. I don't think you're going to have less division. I think you're going to have more division, and I think it's idealistic to think we're going to go back to times that we can never go back to. I personally feel the problem has to get horrible before it can be solved, and I don't think we've really seen horrible yet. And don't misread me. That doesn't mean I like it. I'm just trying to give you an honest feeling, and I don't think we're going to see a cooperative legislature, federal or state. I think we're going to see more division. I think we're going to see more contentiousness. And A great deal of it I blame on the advent of television and the change in media. It's changed the whole political process.
Thank you very much for coming, Betty, Ed, and Brent. I'm Charlotte Richards-Kreitzberg, member from Salem. And I have another question in the same vein, a little more hopeful than what Ed has just said. What do you think Tom McCall from his perch would do right this minute if he was reading the Oregonian lately and saw two different groups from two different ends of the Willamette swimming or biking or canoeing in the rivers of the Columbia and Willamette Slough? And what would you think if he had another group from Salem that came up today and said, how'd you like to help us save the Greenway, Tom? Ed, what do you think he'd say?
What he would say is, I'd work for that totally, but what he would have done to solve the problem, incidentally, is not go to their districts. He would have sent in the state police and the National Guard, and the National Guard would not have carried weapons. The legislature would have conformed.
Do you think he would have approved?
Of which?
Saving the Greenway, his baby.
By all means, by all means.
That, by the way, Bob Straub is here, and it was Bob's idea.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Ken, Brent, do you think that you could say it from Washington? Would Tom McCall approve of saving the Greenway?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody want to help? We're right here.
Robert Liberty, City Club member, and I'm director of an organization that Tom McCall co-founded, 1,000 Friends of Oregon. Now, I wonder if any or all of you could comment on the way that Governor McCall used public interest advocacy groups to advance his agenda for Oregon.
Well, I'd say that basically public interest groups used Tom to advance the agenda because he was in sync with them. And I'm trying to be honest. Tom was not a manipulator. He was wonderful with words. He could stir audiences. He stirred me. That's what changed my life and caused me to go in a different direction, was the speech he gave. But my point is, I think it was more that he was in tune with the advocacy groups than it was that he was using them.
My comment is only that I tried to demonstrate that there was this dramatic rise of public interest groups during the McCall period, and that either Tom McCall encouraged them or they gave encouragement to Tom McCall. It worked both ways. I mean, it was just a part of the times, that it was time for reform, and there was time for the concern for the environment, and it happened together. It was a unique phenomenon.
Yeah, I would agree with that. He created the stage and an incentive for these groups not only to form, but he also had an open door for them to come in and talk to him. And I think it's the other way around, too, that I think that the groups made themselves available to him as opposed to him trying to use them for any particular means.
Thank you.
For each of the members of the panel, I'm Greg Kafuri. A lot of people have been woken up recently by the fact that heavy subsidies are being given to foreign corporations to come here and build $10 billion worth of chip plants. This has the most profound implications for the future of our economy, for immigration in the state. And I wonder what you think McCall would have said about that, and whether you feel that there's enough of his spirit left for our politicians to finally get off this endless refrain about, well, we can't fight growth, we just have to accommodate it, and to actually take the position that maybe we've seen enough and people could stay home and keep their businesses at home, and maybe we should just work with what we've got here.
You know, despite his famous statement, that was really never ever his policy, that is to keep growth down, to halt growth. His idea was to accommodate it and not to reverse it or not to hold it back. One of the great misperceptions and one of the reasons I first started researching this book was that very question. What did McCall actually advocate for economic growth in the state? And it wasn't to shut the doors. It was just to leave them cracked open just wide enough so that we could time it and make accommodation for growth. So I don't think he would say shut him off.
I would emphasize the fact that Tom's environmental stance always was one of balance. he said, you know, we have to have jobs, and but we have to protect our environment. And that was when we all started saying, well, then let's get the clean industries. Well, we're getting the clean, quote, so-called clean industries now. Do we want them, you know, or something else? And so I think that's why Greg has said that this is new times, you know, and our state's changing rapidly and we're growing rapidly. Is that the current political leaders and their leadership in business and education and everything have to address that in terms of what we have today. I think Tom McCall would be saying, okay, so this is balanced, and at least we've controlled the smokestacks now, and so we now are getting the type of industry that I think he would have applauded. Now, how to deal with the growth, I don't know, you know, but that's the challenge.
I was involved in many of the economic development efforts during that period of time, and I endorse what both the other speakers have said, and I'm going to answer you directly. But first, I had not noticed that Governor Straub is here, and I think he should be commended when we're talking about McCall, because he made McCall a much better person. I've never seen two people who had more respect for each other. I thought you said he was here.
No.
Oh, I apologize. I thought I was told he was here. The statement stands. Anyway, in answer to your question, Tom would have supported it. He would have been very aggressive on what the county has been doing, or the counties have been doing, on employment training and a variety of other things to help people who need help. He would have been very supportive of strong planning efforts. And he would have been very supportive of saying, all right, so much is right, too much is wrong. I can't tell you where that right and wrong level would be, but that would be based upon the whole community, what it can absorb, and what positive things occur.
I'd like to add to this really quick. The high-tech industries that we're talking about, McCall may not have been the first to recruit them, but he was very active in it. In fact, Hewlett-Packard in Corvallis was in part the result of his personal lobbying of David Packard. And the story goes, as I understand it, that Packard said, wait a minute, I thought you said come visit but don't stay. You don't want us. And he said, no, I want people like you. So.
I'm Don Wagner, member, and I was active back in the second term of Governor McCall. And at that time, as a citizen lobbyist, I always thought that ideas would get a hearing. And that, yes, I knew there were D's and there were R's, but I also expected that they would vote their hearts. And I think they did. So we never really had a sense of having to come up against this rule of 18, which, frankly, it surprised me the heck out of me to see that that's happened. I would ask the panelists to just trace a little bit, how did we get here? And is there any way to get out where people do then vote their conscience and not have to go through an initial screen to see if it's okay to bring it to the floor?
One response, and it's mine alone, we have to get back to the concept of a citizen legislature, and I broaden that out, of people who are contributing to their community and who are not doing it as a profession. I feel that so strongly it's unreal. You have very different decision making. If it's a profession, you're doing what you feel is necessary to be reelected. You're not doing what you feel is right. And Tom, if we're going to use him as the forum for our comments today, that man honestly never made a decision, ever, based upon being reelected. And that was his strength.
I want to recognize Don Wagner, because when I was, the bottle bill was before my committee, Don Wagner was one of the most aggressive persons supporting the bottle bill. He and Rich Chambers were there at every meeting, and he was sending in material with the amount of litter that was out on the highways and doing all the research. And so, Don, you know, if you were there, I know that, and it was because of you and Rich Chambers that we did get the bottle bill. I want everybody in this room to know that about Don. And I think I can't add any more to what Ed has said about this rule of 18 and how are we going to get people to say this, that some issues aren't partisan and that you know, maybe there may be rural and urban, but in Oregon not nearly as partisan as it has appeared to be, or as it actually has been in the last few legislative sessions. And again, it is who we elect and what we demand of them and continue to demand of them while they're in the legislative session.
There are a lot of reasons. Well, the one that as a reporter I've written about, I think most of all, is the role of money in politics. It used to be that there were limits on what candidates could accept, and even when these limits were lifted, the spending in campaigns, and more to the point, the contributions, didn't explode until really the mid-'80s. And my first session was 1985, and my last one was 1993, and I could see the difference in how we're talking about people voting their hearts, Don, right? It was now more often than not I saw people looking over their shoulder or looking to the galleries to see which way they might vote, which way that the checks might come. A lot of people would say that's a cynical view, and then a lot of politicians would deny that they ever did that. But the role of money and the concern about how they're going to finance not only their own election, but how the party is going to control the House or the Senate, I think became the overwhelming dynamic in those kinds of daily decisions about who would vote for what and why.
We're about to adjourn. I have to make one disclaimer. I favor the chip plants, but that's because I have a very small construction equipment company, and it's a boon to my business.
You can't adjourn yet. I'm Don Sterling, a member. Currently, there's some concern that if Congress does the wrong thing, the Clean Water Act will be weakened and the Willamette will get dirty again. I wonder, I guess I'll address this to Ed. Was it really the federal government that made us clean up the Willamette River?
No. The federal government has had far more impact on our air based upon back when I was involved. Parking limitations in the city, things like that. The cleanup of the Willamette River was the one cause that Tom took into office personal. It was his. I will tell you a story that's personalized on this issue. I live in a houseboat. I only went to one meeting in my life when I was with the governor's office where I had armed bodyguards. And that was to go to a houseboat here in Portland. It's before I lived in one. And Tom had, by governor's order, mandated incinerator toilets in houseboats because they couldn't connect to sewers. So I was to go to explain this to this group of houseboat owners who had all lived along the river there. At any rate, I took state policemen with me. It was a very hostile audience. I talked to them. They made me go in and sit down and flush the toilet while I was sitting on it. It burnt the hell out of me. I understood why they didn't like them. And then years later, when I wanted to move into the Oregon Yacht Club, where they vote you in, every member there reminded me of that action and that visit. Tom was committed to cleaning up the rivers, totally and absolutely.
We have time for one more short question.
I'm not sure how short it is. Don Barney, member of the club. Maybe by way of allowing you to reiterate something you already said, when they're writing the history of Oregon in the middle of the next century, what would be, you'd say, the single greatest accomplishment they'll still attribute to Tom McCall?
Being a total non-politician who did what was right for the state for 8 years, regardless of the consequences.
I think it's probably what I described before, which was to set down the doctrine that recognizing the state's livability and becoming determined to protect it has to be it. I mean, he defined that. He burned it into the state's image and its consciousness, and I think that's what people will remember.
I think the middle of the next century, what they would say about Tom depends upon how damaging our environment has progressed to, or how good it is. If we continue to protect the environment, then I think it can be traced back to Tom McCall, at least in Oregon, and the influence that had on other states and on the nation. If it's deteriorated, it just may be wishful thinking that we wish we were back living 100 years ago. And so I too believe that the fact that Tom was present on this earth during this period of time, and that he took what he had to work with himself, and he did the best he could for this state in terms of both what Ed has said, not being a politician, but recognizing and loving the area that he lived in.
I want to thank our speakers for an excellent program, and I hope that this has spurred you to think about the effect of leadership in your personal life and in the life of the city, county, and state in which you live. The meeting is adjourned.